Hello and welcome to the Indy Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Laura Goode. Hey, Laura, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm so glad to be here, Maddie.
I am thrilled to have you here and to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you. Laura Goode is the author of a collection of poems, Become a Name, and a YA novel, Sister Mischief. She wrote and produced the feature film Farah Goes Bang. Her nonfiction writing has appeared in BuzzFeed, New Republic, New York Magazine, and more. She received her BA and MFA from Columbia University and currently teaches at Stanford University. And Laura's bio includes so many accolades that I can't include them all in this intro, but I did want to include this one that in 2025, she was honored with the Walter J. Gores Award, which is Stanford's highest award for excellence in teaching. So I am super excited to have Laura on the podcast. And I was introduced to Laura by our buddy Jeff Elkins of The Dialogue Doctor. And Jeff had interviewed Laura back in episode 295, Pitching Your Work. And they talked about Laura's book, Pitchcraft. And then Jeff introduced us, as he is very generous in doing, introducing people across the author space. And in looking through Pitchcraft, there were a couple of topics that, honestly, there aren't that many topics I see anymore that I just haven't heard somebody talk about at all. But there were a couple that were completely new to me in terms of pitching. Laura and I are going to be talking generally about pitching and the need for self-advocacy, which I think is especially important for indie author publishers. But I've never heard about the idea of pitching and self-advocacy being related to selecting artistic collaborators. So Laura, please just tell us a little bit about what put this on your radar as something people needed to keep in mind when they are pitching.
Oh man, thank you so much for that beautiful on-ramp. One thing that I love about the way you just brought us to the doorstep of that conversation is I feel like the story you just told perfectly illustrates the principle that I'm talking about here,
Yeah.
right? It is so important to have good art friends. It is so important to have the people who can connect you to other people and who are excited enough about your work to be like, there's this other person you have to talk to. Like, there's so much good faith in that kind of just movement through the world. And I'm so appreciative to Jeff for introducing us in that way. But that illustrates exactly what I mean here. I really believe that writing especially, I think a lot of this book is very applicable across creative disciplines, but I do think that writing is uniquely lonely amidst those disciplines. You know, dancers and musicians and actors, they get to hang out with other people a lot more than we do, and I get jealous of that sometimes. And so pinning that to self-advocacy, I think such an important part of taking yourself seriously as a writer is taking yourself seriously enough to offer yourself support, you know, and compassion for the fact that it's hard and lonely sometimes. I don't know about you, Maddie, but for me, I mean, my art friends have just been such a crucial part of like keeping the psychological ship afloat, as well as, you know, foisting contacts upon me and like collaborations and those kinds of things. But I really just believe even as the weird little lonely odd ducks that we are as writers, we just have to like ride with a team too. So that's really how I see those friendship connections.
Yeah, I've been talking a lot lately about co-authoring. I wrote a book with Michael Aron on co-authoring nonfiction, and that idea of all the benefits you get in
To-
a creative collaboration that brings
Yeah.
the product even to a higher level of achievement. But those things that are going on behind the scenes are so important as well. Can you just describe, maybe for examples from your own life that would be applicable for authors, about the kinds of collaborations, the artistic collaborations that you've had or that you've seen those around you have, and
Mhm.
how you see that feeding into self-advocacy?
Such a good question. Okay. I have so many thoughts. You know, I'm like, where do I start, Maddie? How that feeds into self-advocacy, I think, is again taking yourself seriously enough to offer support. And some examples that I can point to, it's funny, Pitchcraft is just littered with examples of how this has played out in my life. I'm thinking of the acknowledgement section right now, which is such a special part of every book that I think nobody should ever skip. But one of the things that came up for me when I was writing my acknowledgments in terms of who I wanted to thank, because I really saw them as having embroiled themselves with the journey of this book, were who were the people that saw something in me that I didn't see in myself at that time. There's there's a lot of collaborators who can be really special who don't have to reach that level. But to me, those are the people who have impacted me the most. I'm thinking of my friend Meera Menon, with whom I co-wrote a screenplay. You were just talking about the co-writing process. She just looked at me over a beer in like 2009 and she was like, "You're organized and good with money. You could be a film producer." And I was like, of all the thoughts I have never had in my life, you know, I don't know what a film producer does or knows, but I know that I love and I trust Mira and that I trust her perspective. And so it was really meaningful and transformative. I did become a film producer because she said that. And it was really meaningful and transformative just that she saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. So I'm always encouraging my students, especially my undergrads, to just like lean on each other and confide in each other and speak to each other about your dreams. But I think the really most special people are the people who can just look a little bit closer at you and be like, there's some unfulfilled potential here, and I want to be with you to fulfill it. Like, that's a special kind of bond, right?
Yeah. And it raises an interesting differentiation, maybe, that when I think of collaborators, I think of peers. And when I think of mentors, I think of the people like
Yeah,
that experience you had with a friend who suggested that maybe film production was, producing a film was right for you. Sounds almost like a mentor role because, it
totally.
was somebody who maybe had experience in that area and was pointing you in a direction that she felt would be productive for you. Do you see similarities or differences between how you tap into that opportunity for self-advocacy among your peer group versus among people who are maybe where you would like to be yourself that you're
Oh,
using as a
that's so
mentor?
interesting. That's a great question too. I think what mentors and allies have in common that's important is that they're rooting for you. They celebrate your success. They're not threatened by your success. Like they glow more when you glow. I think that finding that place of celebrating your smart, talented friends, I think that takes some practice and some maturity, Like I think it takes working through some jealousy in order to do that too. And one of the things that I say in the book is that jealousy is a really human and unavoidable feeling, and that if we can use it as information, it in fact points to what we want, and it can be incredibly valuable as a sort of laser beam for that. But I think that if I'm thinking about self-advocacy, I think that bringing in all of those human feelings is so important to that, including the jealousy. So I guess what I find about the best mentors and allies who are truly happy for your success and truly rooting for your success is they've probably done some work on themselves, that allows them to be happy for other people's successes and not threatened by them. And those are the kind of people that I want to be and that I want to have around me. You also asked as part of this question, like, what is the difference between people who are peers and people who are a little bit ahead of you or where you want to be career wise? And this also comes up in the book. I call those people who are maybe 3 to 5 years ahead of where you are and where you want to be. I call them career comps because I think that those people, again, especially if some like messy feelings like jealousy come up, I think those people can be really useful templates. I tell a truly, Maddie, like deranged story in the book about a time that my ex-boyfriend brought a new girl who was really talented into the bar where I was working at the time in grad school when I was getting my MFA. And I was so jangled by this, I went home and Googled the girl and found out that she had been published like all over the place and she was super talented. And what was the next thing I did? I submitted poems to every place that had ever published her. Like
And
truly like one of the nuttiest things that I've ever done. But that led to the publication of one of my first poems. And I think that even though there's so much about that story that like embarrasses me now, like Googling someone at 4 in the morning, I'm so glad that I let it point me towards what I wanted instead of trying to tear her down. That would have been the truly unhinged thing to do that people also do all the time. So that's one illustration in which that's how I came to the idea of this sort of career comp and why I think it's so important to let all the feelings point us towards what we want instead of what anybody else is doing.
yeah, it's interesting. The word comp is unfortunate because I speak with authors who are just getting into exploring like the publishing side of things.
Yep.
And sometimes they'll hear comps and in the process of talking about it with them, you realize that they think it's competition, not comparables. And so,
How interesting is
yeah,
that? That makes total sense, but I never thought of that before.
yeah.
Fascinating.
And I think that in some cases it's easier to get past that. Like if you're writing mystery novels, then
Yeah.
no reader anywhere ever said, "Oh, I've already got a mystery novel. I don't need another one." That's not how that works. And so it's easier to say, "Okay, yes, I'm going to." I mean, the example I always go back to is being at a book fair. If you're at a book
Mhm.
fair, let's say you're with your like fellow mystery writers and a reader comes to the table. This happened to me years ago. I was at a table at a local bookstore. It was a whole bunch of authors and three of us were all writing mysteries, but they were very
Mhm.
different. Like mine are supernatural mysteries, another one was kind of like family drama mysteries, and one was more sort of humorous mysteries. And so it was very easy for us to get into this groove of the reader comes to the table and we say, what kind of mystery do you like? And you say, oh, I like to laugh when I'm reading mystery. And we were like,
Oh, that's
well, you
brilliant.
want this person's,
That
you
one,
want this
yeah.
person's, or you want mine. And so that wasn't so hard. That felt comfortable. Like it felt
Yeah,
comfortable both from a creative and friendly point of view and also sort of from a business point of view. But
totally.
I think that there's also this feeling of and I think you and Jeff used this phrase in your conversation, the supply and demand issue that
Yep.
pulls people back from having that kind of generosity that can really make other artists collaborators with you. Can you talk a little bit about how that factors in?
It's so tempting to think that success is a zero-sum game, right? That if you get something, it means I don't get something. And that, I'm so happy to say, is just not how life works. Like, yes, the economics of supply and demand are real, but I love the story you just told about banding together with those other two mystery authors and being like, we've got something for everybody. Just talk to us, and we three together are going to be really charming and engaging. And you're probably going to walk away having bought at least one of our books. That is, again, a beautiful illustration of exactly, I think, the power of collaboration over competition. I also love the conflation of comp as in comparable title with competition. That's fascinating. And like that's a very like double-sided mirror of exactly, I think, what's going on there. Can we admire something enough or someone enough to want to emulate what they're doing in some way without wishing them badly or wanting to take what they have or believing that if they have something, that means we don't? Like that's again a very like deep psychological paradigm shift that I think it requires some self-work that isn't just about literature.
Yeah.
So that, like that's kind of how I see the two sides of that coin.
And I do think that in the indie space, it's a little easier to be generous in that way because you're
Sure.
not competing for the
Yes.
limited slots that are available
Yes.
within a traditional publisher, or as I am now going to describe it, a third party publisher. It's very clearly 10 slots for every 1,000 writers who would love to fill those slots. And
Sure.
so maybe maybe it's understandable when people are less likely to say, hey, I hear that so and so publisher is looking for a new mystery. Why don't you
Sure.
send yours in at the same time I sent mine in? And
Yeah, sure.
and it's a
I
little
do.
easier to be generous in
It
when you're
is.
not
It
relying on a
is.
third party in that way.
No, and I relate to what you're saying through the lens of when I got my MFA, I was studying poetry, and there's no dollars for poetry. So the poets had not like we knew we weren't competing against each other for six-figure book deals. That wasn't a thing that was going to happen. I feel like I saw a lot more sort of cutthroat competition in fiction and nonfiction because there was more at stake there. So that's an analogy to what you just said. Yes.
Yeah. I also realized that earlier when I had said that it sounded like the woman who had suggested film producing for you, was maybe somebody who already had experience in that, and you had said you think of it as like the position you want in a few years. And I realized that as I'm thinking of it more, I'm thinking maybe that wasn't the right way for me to frame up mentorship because I
Hmm.
also imagine that mentors are not necessarily the people who hold the position that you want to hold in a few years. They could be
Sure.
someone from a totally different
Yeah.
profession, even.
Mm-hmm.
And so, can you talk a little bit when you want to expand your artistic collaborators to finding a mentor?
Yeah.
What does that look like? What should people be looking for? Is it someone you can actually go look for? Or is it just something that happens serendipitously?
Such a good question. I think it's both. I think it's possible to put yourself in good positions to find them and that there's a specific chemistry to that relationship that just has to find you. When I look over where I have found mentors in my life, certainly some of them have come through formal structures like school, like on my undergraduate and graduate writing programs. But honestly, it's so much broader than that. Some of the best mentors I ever had, like, hung out in the bar where I used to work. I worked at this bar up at Columbia University that, like, just had a lot of smart people hanging out, reading books at it. And, like, the conversations around that bar were fantastic for that reason. I also think indie authors can be really well advised to look into short-term residency opportunities or fellowships or writers like retreats, those kinds of things. I think a couple $100 spent in that kind of direction can often be very connective towards both like peers and mentors. I went to the Breadloaf Writers Conference for the first time 6 years ago. And oh my God, the number of contacts that I added to my network from just 10 days in that was miraculous. So I know it's so hard for very few working people, especially working people with kids, are going to be like, I'm going to go sign up for a 2-year full-time MFA program and I will come out of it with all the contacts we need. That's not realistic for most people. But a weekend writers retreat, a 10-day residency, things like that, there's so many of those out there. And I think those can be really, really connective opportunities.
Do you feel as if the writing retreat kind of scenarios, in what ways do they differ from like a writer's conference? I would guess that in a lot of cases, the retreats are more focused on craft and the conferences may be more focused on
Yeah,
both craft and business. But
I
do you
think that's
feel
right.
like what you get out of, in terms of artistic collaboration, out of those two sorts of events are very different?
What a good way to frame that. So I think I agree with the plot of what you just said. I think that generally conferences are more about networking, going to a bunch of lunches, going to a bunch of panel discussions, like that kind of absorbent time. And residencies and retreats are more often about like they're going to give you some writing time. I do think that you meet a lot of people in both of those frameworks. Even at the residencies where you're locked in a room with your novel for hours a day, you're still going to meet other people for dinner. And I think oftentimes those relationships can become quite deep. So I guess as I'm verbally processing my way through this, I have looked towards those opportunities more in terms of networking value than in terms of finishing my novel value, just because that feels more attainable within the scope of what they're offering. So I do think either residencies or retreats or conferences can be really valuable in expanding your network.
And do you think it's important to go into those having a goal in mind of what kind of collaboration you hope to leave with? Like, it would be
Mm,
easy if you were thinking, I really want a traditional book publishing deal, and so I'm going here specifically to meet people who are knowledgeable about that or who can
mhm.
pave the way or what have you. And also the scenario where you go into it just kind of thinking, I'm going to be open to ideas and see what comes up. Have
Interesting.
you found that one or the other of those, like the more goal directed interactions with people or the more sort of open to serendipitous circumstances, works better to find those successful collaborations?
I guess it's so funny. You're asking a very strategic question, and I feel like I'm thinking of when I went to Breadloaf in 2019. I had 2 kids under 5. I actually had to miss my older son's first week of kindergarten to go to this 10-day writers conference, which was a really big deal that I felt really conflicted about. And I feel like I was so scattered and just scrambled going into that I really had no idea what I was walking into. I was like, it'll be 10 days in Vermont. I have no idea what this is. Maybe I'll get some work done. I don't know. Like, I really had no expectations because I was just so overwhelmed in that point of my life. And I don't know if this is correct for everybody. Maybe some people would want to go in a very goal oriented way. And I think it's good to have a project that you're working on for any of those forums. I think that'll center what you have to talk about with people in a good way. And I had a project I was working on. I knew what I was there to workshop. The structure of Breadloaf is you do like a couple workshops and then there's all these other panels and readings and stuff that you can attend, but they're not really going to leave you alone in your room to write. You're doing things a lot of the time. I went into it so unprepared and was so like positively overwhelmed by what I found there. There was so many things per day that I wanted to do that I could have been in talks, from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day if my nervous system could have handled that, but it definitely couldn't. And about halfway through the conference, I was so joyfully overwhelmed that I had this image of just like seaweed and water, where I was like, it seems like when I walk out of my little cabin, every time I do that, I fall into an interesting, fascinating, high stakes conversation with someone I've never met before. But I know because they're here, they have faced many of the same challenges that I've faced and they have bled for their work in the way that I've bled for their work. And I'm a very type A, like hyper planner person. So it was kind of remarkable for me to just like decide to let go in this way. But once I sort of succumbed to the seaweed image and I was just like, I like all the experiences that I'm having. So I'm just going to like go spontaneously from one to the next. It was so pleasurable for me and it made me feel so much more absorbent and open to possibility. So I don't think it would be bad to go into something with a very distinct goal in mind. Certainly, I know there were people there who were like, I really want to get a literary agent. I really want specific feedback from this one specific person on my essay or whatever. But I think the seaweed approach can yield what we're now going to call the seaweed approach can yield a lot of fruit too.
I think that the other side of that, the best way to look for a mentor is, and I think this gets back to self advocacy, the willingness to put yourself forward as the mentor. Like when
Yep.
authors talk about mentorship, it's almost always in the sense of, this is my mentor, I'm looking for a mentor, this is what I learned from my mentor. Maybe it's just because people are like not tooting their own horn, but you hardly ever hear people talking about their experience as a mentor. And also,
Mm.
it's not really, I don't think people go out like with a goal of getting a mentee. It's,
No, that's true. I
it feels
agree.
weird. So, and I think there's also just this underlying, I don't want to lean too heavily on stereotypes, but it's easy to think, well, what do I have to share
Of
that would
course.
qualify me as a mentor? So, can you talk a little bit about the other side of that mentorship relationship? If
Hmm.
what is a person's responsibility as a member of the literary community to offer mentorship as well as to accept mentorship?
I love the way you put that because I think it is such a distinct responsibility for any of us who have been lucky enough to be published or get a formal writing education or attend the kind of retreats like Breadloaf. Like, that's hard to do. And it happened in part because a lot of people took a lot of risks on me and invested in me and vouched for me. And I feel very aware and very grateful for how certain people cleared the way for me, like put their credibility behind my name. So I do think that like mentorship is part of a self-renewing resource within the writing community. It's again, it's so hard, it's so solitary, it's so hard to know if you're getting anywhere with it so much of the time, like you get so little feedback for long stretches that I do think it's really important for those of us who are older and more experienced to keep investing in the new talent, both because I want to read the books that that talent is going to produce. And I genuinely believe that the world will benefit from those books. And also just because I remember how hard it was to be 22 and sending out all of these submissions and getting crickets and silence. So I think it's an action that is both about renewing the collective and keeping new talent fertile and active, but I also think it's about just showing compassion for our younger selves that makes it really important.
Yeah, I think another tricky part is understanding someone enough to know when mentorship is appropriate. And the
Mhm.
example that always comes up when I
Mhm.
have this kind of conversation with guests is that there was a period of time when everybody was rapid release. Everybody in the indie world was rapid release. And so a lot of the communities that one could attach themselves to, they were all talking about rapid release. I'm
Mhm.
putting out a book every other month or something like that. And
Jeez.
if yeah, if
I
that was
can't
a
imagine. Yeah.
no. And I think there was a group of people who were actually producing a book every other month, and then there were the group of people who heard the message, knew they couldn't do it, so they were, like, stockpiling, you know, who would work for, like, 3 years in order to have a set of books so they could do a rapid releasing, at which point I believe rapid release was no longer a thing. But that idea of being in a community and then understanding where your goals and your experiences align
Mhm.
nicely with the other people in that group
Mhm.
would make your advice or your mentorship more or less appropriate.
Yeah.
How do you go about making sure that if you're offering mentorship, you're offering the right mentorship for the person that you're interacting with?
Well, that's I what I love about that question is how it circumscribes that mentorship has to be very consensual, right? In both directions. You can't foist mentorship. Like that would be a really weird kind of betrayal to condescend to someone enough to be like, I am here to be your mentor when they didn't ask for that at all, right? I think that I have had the luxury of having the framework of the university behind me for a lot of the mentor journey, like students are coming to me as students, right? So they're walking into my class with the premise already in hand that I know something that they don't. Sometimes that's not true, but that is the premise from which we tend to begin. But I do think I think that how do I say this? You know what I'm thinking about, Maddie? I'm thinking about people pleasing and how gendered it is. And have you ever heard the phrase, I think this goes back to Anne Lamott, help is the sunny side of control?
Oh, no, I've
That's
never heard of that before.
couldn't you just lay down for 2 days after hearing that? That really has laid me out a couple times. So I do think that what we're both talking about is it's a really crucial part of initiating any mentor-mentee relationship is the mentee has to ask for help, right? And it's a betrayal and a condescension unless that request for help is directly being put forth in some way. So I think that the asking for help is what builds the sort of crucial consent at the center of that relationship.
Well, I realize that one of the reasons that you don't really hear authors talking about themselves as mentors is that they get called coaches. I'm realizing that's
Mm.
how it plays out in the author world.
Mhm.
You're expert at publishing, so you offer coaching services regarding publishing or regarding finishing your novel or regarding writing a memoir, whatever that might be.
Mhm.
And so I guess that in many cases, someone who's doing that as a service through coaching or consulting is in a sense being a mentor for hire.
Mhm. Mhm. That's so interesting. You're making me think, like, what is the difference between a coach and a mentor?
Yeah.
And this is hardly like definitive, but one thing that just comes up as I consider that question is I think a coach and maybe also a consultant is specifically working towards like a winning outcome, right? A coach is there to help the team win, right? That's the goal of the coach. I don't think that a mentor or a teacher is there to help a person win in the same way. I think they're there to help a person learn. And that can direct itself towards any number of outcomes that the mentor has no control, can put influence behind, but ultimately has no control over. So that actually ends up feeling like a pretty important distinction to me. I don't think I'm coaching anyone towards winning. I hope that I am teaching people towards knowing themselves better. And those two feel like two different goals to me.
Yeah. What would you advise people in terms of if they are going to, if they have a mentor, maybe this is a long-term relationship where they're offering mentorship to someone, are there some flags that say, okay, now this relationship is sort of reaching the limits of its usefulness? Um,
Mm-hmm.
what is a sign that somebody should be extracting themselves from a mentor-mentee relationship and moving on to someone or something else?
Gosh, I love that question. Because that happens to all of us, right? Like, there's no kind of relationship that can't be outgrown, right? So mentor-mentee relationships are just the same. I think I'm thinking towards certain mentors in my early life where eventually the usefulness of their advice just didn't hold the same resonance that it did. And those were people in some cases who had given me very good advice before that. It wasn't like I'd learned nothing from the relationship. But for whatever reason, because of misalignment or different life stages or having learned all I could from that person, there are certain people where things that they started to say to me just didn't ring true because they felt like they were coming from a place of bad faith or because they just didn't feel applicable to my life. So I think that with any advice or feedback that we're intaking from people, be they mentors or peers, I think we all have to sort of tune in with our own sort of gut level tuning fork and be like, does this feel right to me? Does this feel generative to me? Anything that doesn't sit right to you, you don't have to take. And I think that this is a good principle to think about with writing workshops and the kind of class, like the kind of experiences that can take place in retreats anytime writers are giving feedback on each other's work. There's going to be stuff that's useful to you, and there's going to be stuff that is of no use to you whatsoever. And it's your job to tell the difference. I think the same is true with mentors. And anything that's not sitting with you, anything that's nagging at you, anything that just doesn't feel right, that's okay, and that could be an indication that it's time to move forward.
What do you think? Maybe this is a good way to sort of wrap up the conversation, and that is, I think that sometimes people, I think that judgment about alignment or increasing misalignment is easier if you have a plan in place. You're working toward a goal and
Mm-hmm.
you've found somebody that either you can help or can help you pursue that
Mm-hmm.
goal. And and so when the alignment starts to shift, it's easier to recognize. But I also think that there are people who are hoping to define that goal by working with a mentor.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Like, there are the goals and then there's advice you get to either identify or reach the goal. How
Mm-hmm.
does that factor in either for mentorship roles or just for artistic collaborations?
How does the difference between relying on someone to define a goal versus working with someone to achieve a goal? Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, I like that
Interesting.
way of thinking of it.
That's so interesting. I feel like I have so much more often, as both a mentor and a mentee, relied upon those relationships to help me define the goals themselves. I think it's so funny because part of the way you ask your question reminds me a little bit of the way these very overachieving Stanford students will sometimes come to me and they'll be like, okay, Laura, what are the 5 to 10 things I need to do during my undergrad years to like certainly ensure that I will become a best-selling author before age 25? And I'm like, not only do I have no idea how to answer that question, I also know that when I was your age, I was doing absolutely none of this strategic planning. So maybe this is because I'm a verbal processor too. I'm the kind of person who tends to gain a lot and like benefit a lot from like transparent conversations. I feel like the purpose of a mentor is not to define the goal for you, but to offer their reflective surface to help you define and crystallize the goal. Or at least that's how it's gone for me most of the time. Does that answer your question? Did I get there?
Yeah, I think so. And I think also it sort of blurs the line in a positive way between mentorship and collaboration,
Mm-hmm.
because I think a lot of times, I think back to conversations I've had with peers, and it's the very fact of talking through whatever the issue was, like even if the other person never said anything that helped, I
Yeah.
would get done talking and then I would say, okay, never mind. Because I just figured it out.
Exactly, exactly, because just the companionship and the witness is so powerful. Yes, I feel what you just described is how I often feel when I've served on a dissertation committee for a PhD student, which means I'm working with them for several years, oftentimes going over several drafts of the same work, like really getting to know them. And these students tend to be so brilliant that I feel like my job and so clear on what they actually are doing a lot of the time without needing me to direct them that I often feel like it really is just my job to listen and sort of provide reflective listening. What I just heard you say was what seems like is really important to you about this is I'm not adding information to the conversation. I'm just reflecting back what they already know. But as you just described, that can be incredibly clarifying and powerful. So I think that that's both really important and very involved with the lack of egotism that I think good mentorship provides. Like an egotistical approach to mentorship would be like, I want to make this person exactly like me, and I need them to prioritize what I prioritize and achieve what I have achieved. That's not my approach as a mentor at all. My approach as a mentor is just like, what is important to you and how can I help you get closer to that? And that I think is another pretty important paradigm shift.
Well, I'm going to put a piece of work on you that I normally do myself, but in
Okay.
most podcast episodes, after the interview is done and I've got it and all edited, and I think about a question I can pose to my listeners to encourage them to think back through what they've just heard.
Hmm.
So I'm going to ask you what you think a question is that our listeners should consider for themselves that would, you know, you floated so many great ideas related to collaboration and mentorship. And if people are intrigued, but they're still processing it, is there anything that you can suggest that would be, here's a question that you can consider for yourself that is going to help crystallize some of the things that we've been talking about?
Oh, I love that. Okay, so I have two questions that are coming up. One as a sort of X-ray scan for collaborators, and one as a sort of X-ray self for this scan for the self. For the collaborators, I think the biggest question, collaborators, mentors, people who are in your artistic network, any network, I think the question I would ask is this person someone I want to emulate? Like, is this person someone who, if I became more like them, that would seem like a positive change to me. Like, those are always the people I want to have around me. As I consider the questions that people can ask themselves to move themselves forward in their writing practice, I think I write in the book that I really had to renegotiate what success was for me because I had put so much pressure on myself to chase external validation in order to define my goals, my dreams, my worth. And the hard question that I really had to get down to get under that egotism was, do I believe I was born worthy of belonging and love? Or do I believe that that is something that I have to earn? And like, why or why not? I think that is a question that every writer and maybe even every person could be well served by asking themselves.
At the risk of launching into part two of a podcast episode, what have you seen are the benefits and the pitfalls depending on how a person answers that question?
I think that most people learned somewhere along the way that they had to earn love, particularly the kind of people who are eager to chase the kind of accomplishments like publication. So I think that what I think is the next layer of that question is why do I think that I have to work to earn love and belonging and that I wasn't just born worthy of that? And in what ways am I working to earn these things that were always mine? And that's probably about 10 years of therapy right there, right?
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. I mean, I've never thought in terms of the, like, do I deserve collaboration? Do I deserve mentorship? I'm not positive that's where you were
Belonging.
going with that, but that's
But that's a mode of belonging. Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
Oh my goodness.
Right?
Yeah, I think we're gonna get a lot of interesting reactions from that. But yeah. Well, I think it sort of maybe loops back to what we were saying earlier about the power of creativity and, generally in of indie authorship specifically is this idea that you can extract yourself from the competitiveness of your
Yes.
environment a little bit,
Yes.
and that maybe there's a connection between disconnecting from that competitiveness and recognizing that you and all the other people around you are worthy of that kind of collaboration and support.
I'm just sitting here waving my hands because you were just banging it out and I didn't want to interrupt you. But like, yes, exactly. Exactly. If I believe that I was born worthy of love and belonging and that I never have to earn it, then I have no reason to try to take anything from anybody else or resent what they have or like that. It's a foundation level renovation. And I think that all of us, certainly I know I have wrestled so much with like, why am I chasing these brass rings and why don't they make me happy when I get them? Like the foundation of happiness is it's an inside job and it's in a different place than that.
So fantastic. Well, Laura, obviously we could keep talking about this for hours and hours, but I think we've
Days.
delivered a huge amount of information for people to consider
Wonderful.
and think about. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm very much looking forward to what people's comments are going to be when they consider some of the questions that you brought up. And
I can't wait.
yeah,
Some of those questions came very directly from my book Pitchcraft: The Writer's Guide to Getting Agented, Published, and Paid, which is out now and also has an audiobook if you want to hear me ask those questions in this voice again. But thank you, Maddie. This was such a pleasure.
if people are interested in hearing about other of your work, where should they go to find out about that?
I am very findable. I have vanquished all the other Laura Goods on the internet. You can go to my website, lauragoode.com. You can go to my Substack, lauragoode.substack.com. And my Instagram is The Real Laura Good. And I would love to connect you with you in any of those places.
Great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Maddie.